So in the first course section, we learned what React is and what it's about. We had a first general overview of React and why we might want to use it. In this course section, we are now going to dive into all the basics you need to know to build any kind of React app. We're going to explore all the base features, and most importantly, we are going to learn how to build component-driven user interfaces. So how to build user interfaces by embracing a concept called components, which turns out is actually embraced by React. And of course, I will explain what exactly these components are and why React embraces them in this course section as well. Now, specifically for that, as I said, we're going to learn about all the base features that make up React, all the core syntax. We're specifically also going to learn about a feature called JSX, or a special syntax called JSX, what that is and why we use it. Then, as I also mentioned, we're also going to learn what these components are, but most importantly also how we can build our own components with React and how we can use them and how we can work with them. And we're going to learn how we can work with data in React apps. Because most web applications are not just about showing some static text, but about outputting some data or updating some data when things change on the screen. And that's therefore also what we're going to learn in this course section, but also in the next course sections in general. Now, of course, I don't want to teach these things by just using some boring theory or slides. We will have all the required theory, though hopefully it's not boring, but we will also build this first example project here, this example web application. This here is entirely built with React, and we are going to build it together throughout this and the next course sections. And I'm saying and the next course sections because it turns out that React has a bunch of core features, and we will need a lot of these features in this application. It might look fairly trivial, but it actually isn't. Once we finished this first application, which also is not the only one in the course, you will have learned about basically all important key concepts which you need over and over again in any React app you're going to build. Now, what is that though? It's an expense tracker. We can see our expenses also by year here. We can filter. And you see, as I filter, this user interface automatically updates. It updates and with a nice animation, and it shows us the expenses for a selected year. And of course, we can also add a new expense. For example, maybe I bought some books for $39 in 2020, let's say on December 16th. And if I add this expense here, you see it shows up here, the chart updates, and the data is also there if I switch to another year and then back to 2020. So this expense tracker is what we're going to get started with, and as we're going to build it step by step, we are going to learn about all the key concepts you gotta know when working with React. So let's now dive into all these important basics and fundamentals. And for that, keep in mind what you learned in the first course section. React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And we also learned that, of course, in general, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are about building user interfaces as well. But I also mentioned in the first course section that we use libraries like React because that simplifies building those user interfaces. We don't need it. You can build any website without React. But if you're having more complex user interfaces, like the one we have in this expense tracker, if you use something like React, it all of a sudden becomes much easier to build something like this. You won't have to focus on all the nitty-gritty details, and it will be less error-prone if you use something like React, because you will be able to focus on your core business logic that makes up your application instead of having to focus on the actual steps of updating the page when something happens somewhere. That's why we use libraries like React. And to make that job simpler for us, to make that work simpler for us, React embraces a concept called components. React is all about components. But of course, that brings up one important question. What exactly is a component? Well, let me come back to this question in a second. Instead, let me come back to this first sentence here. Even though we don't fully know yet what components are, why could React be about one concept in its core? Because all user interfaces in the end are made up of components. So what could be a component then, if it is something which is crucial in all user interfaces you see? Well, let's have a look at this finished application which we're going to build throughout this and the next course sections. If you have a look at this user interface, at this web application, you might be able to identify a couple of building blocks that make up this interface. For example, have a look at the expense items down there. This in the end is the same item being repeated twice here. It's the same item, just with different data. The same would be true, by the way, here for this chart. The individual bars in that chart, that's the same item, just repeated with a different label and a different amount of filling. And that is exactly what components are. Reusable building blocks in your user interface. Components are in the end just a combination of HTML code, CSS code for styling, and possibly JavaScript code for some logic. And you don't have to reuse a component to make it a component. It's just one of its traits that it is reusable. But on this user interface, which you see here, there would be more components than just these expense items and these chart bars. The item here at the top would be a component. If we expand it, this would then be more elements inside of that component. That filter here would be a component. The overall chart would be a component. The overall list of items would be a component. But inside of the items, we could say this date item here would be a separate component. The amount here would be a component. We can really split it up in a very granular way if we want to. We got all these individual building blocks which we combine together to build a user interface. And in the end, of course, all user interfaces can be split up into components like this, into containers and buttons and input elements and product items which are being output, something like that. All user interfaces on all kinds of web applications can be split up into components like this. And React is all about these components. You build these individual components, and then you tell React how to compose them together into a final user interface. And React embraces this concept of components because of that reusability aspect and because it allows us to separate our concerns. Both concepts are important concepts in programming in general. Having reusable building blocks helps us avoid repetition. And in programming in general, it is good if we don't repeat ourselves. Having a separation of concerns helps us with keeping our code base small and manageable. Instead of having one large file which holds all the HTML code and all the JavaScript logic for the entire user interface, we have small separated units, these components, where every component has one clear concern, one focus, one specific task it focuses on. And if we split that code across multiple files, then as we are going to do it throughout this course, then we'll have small pieces of code which are easy to manage and maintain. And these, of course, are not concepts or ideas React invented. Instead, if we take a step back from React and we think about programming in general, then of course, in any programming language, and no matter what you're building, you tend to work with functions. And you split your code into multiple small functions, which then may call each other to outsource logic into a function to separate concerns and to be able to execute the same code multiple times if you need to. And React just picks up that concept of functions and of separating code across functions and translates it to the front-end web application world, where we build an entire user interface by splitting our code into multiple components, which we then can mix and match as we need to. So React is all about components, and I hope I could make it clear why it's all about components and what exactly a component is. So therefore, the next question is, how exactly is a component built? Now we'll dive into the concrete code in just a second. In general, it's just important to keep in mind what I mentioned earlier. In the end, user interfaces are about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And therefore, all these components are about combining HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. When we work with React and we build components, we in the end do just that. We combine HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in all these components, and then we combine all these components together to build the entire user interface. Though I will say, whilst CSS of course matters, and we're going to add CSS in this course, it's the least important part here. Mostly, React components are about combining HTML and JavaScript. And then, of course, you also can add CSS, but that's not the focus of React. Nonetheless, I will teach you, of course, how you can make sure that your components look beautiful. So, long story short, React is all about components and about building these components which we combine together. React allows you to create these reusable and reactive components, and you are going to see what reactive means in detail later. React allows you to build these reusable and reactive components consisting of HTML and JavaScript, and as I mentioned, also a bit of CSS. Now here's the important part though. As you will learn throughout this course, React uses something which is called a declarative approach for building these components. And you will see what exactly that is. But it basically means that with React, you will not tell React that a certain HTML element should be created and inserted in a specific place on the user interface, as you would be doing it with vanilla JavaScript, so with just JavaScript, for example. Instead, with React, and that's really important, you will always define the desired end state, the target state, or possibly also different target states depending on different conditions. And it's then React's job to figure out which elements on the actual web page might need to be added or removed or updated. And you don't write these concrete DOM updating instructions on your own, as you would be doing it with just JavaScript. Instead, with React and React components, you just define these end states and under which conditions which state should be used. And then React will do all of the rest under the hood. It's a bit like magic. It's of course not actual magic, but it will make your life as a developer much easier. So you could say that in the end, we just build our own custom HTML elements and we combine them together for building a user interface. But that's enough of the theory for now. Let's now finally dive into some code and start building these components. Now, to start our work, on this course project, and to finally start writing some React code, we need a React project. And the easiest way of getting started with a React project is to use a tool called Create React App. You can simply Google for Create React App to find this GitHub repository with more information about it. You can also visit create-react-app.dev for the full documentation. Now, this is a tool which you can use to create React projects, which are basically pre-configured folders with some basic React code files and, most importantly, a bunch of configuration files which help you build that React app for production use, because it turns out that there will be a couple of transformation and optimization steps between developing a React app and running a React app in production, but more on that later. And in addition, this project, which is created with Create React App, will give you a nice development environment with a development web server, which allows you to preview the application locally on your machine, and it will allow you to preview this application in a way where the browser will automatically update the page whenever you make changes in your code and so on. That's why we use a tool like Create React App. It simply simplifies our development process. It adds a couple of key transformation steps which we need, and it will later also help us optimize our React code before we push it to a production server. Now, getting started with Create React App is simple. In the end, you find all important steps here. However, to execute these steps, you first of all need to visit node.js.org. Node.js is a technology which is not directly related to React. It is in the end a runtime for JavaScript, which would allow you to run JavaScript code outside of the browser. And therefore, of course, it's not something we need at all for React, because React code is JavaScript code that runs in the browser. We will need Node.js, however, for this Create React App tool. To run this command here, we'll need Node.js installed on our system. Otherwise, this will fail. And behind the scenes, the project, which is generated by Create React App, will use Node.js for this development preview server and for these behind the scenes transformation and optimization steps, which we also need to build production ready applications. Therefore, you should visit node.js.org and simply download that latest version here. Whichever version that is when you're visiting this page. The exact version doesn't matter. Simply download this version here, save it somewhere on your system, and walk through the installer this gives you. I'm on Mac OS here, but you'll get a similar installer on Windows, and you should simply walk through that installer, accept all these default settings here, and in the end simply finish this Node.js installation. Again, it works in the same way on Mac OS and Linux and Windows. Once you got Node.js installed, you are ready to execute these commands to create a new React application and therefore a new folder, to then navigate into that folder and to then run a special script which exists inside of that project folder to bring up a development server, this preview server I was talking about. But we are going to do that together. So simply copy this command and then open your default terminal or command prompt on Windows, and then, important, navigate inside of this terminal into a folder where you want to create your React project. You can navigate around with the cd command, which stands for change directory, and you then should ultimately go into a path where you do want to create this new project. For me, I'll just navigate into my desktop folder here, and then simply copy in this npx command. However, I'll change the name of the to-be-created project to React Complete Guide, since that is what this course is. Simply hit enter thereafter, and this will now create this new React project in the destination where you executed this command. It will create a folder with that name you picked here, in my case, React Complete Guide, and inside of that folder, it'll set up all the key files you need to write React code and build your React application. Now, as you can see, this might take a couple of minutes here to finish, and therefore I will be back once it is finished. If you are facing errors here, definitely also check the Q&A section, but most importantly, make sure that you don't have a proxy, firewall, or VPN client that might be blocking outgoing connections or might be interfering here. The same goes for antivirus software. Now, once this finished, you should see something like this, and you can now cd into this created folder simply by running cd and then the folder name, and then in there run npm start. And this will now start this development server, which hosts a preview of this React application, and it will automatically open up this application on localhost 3000. If it doesn't open this page automatically, you can manually visit localhost 3000 in your browser. Now there you should see something like this. The exact look and what you see in detail here might change over time, but you should see some starting page, some dummy React application which is set up for you. Now, of course, we're ready to edit this code. And for this, I already recommended Visual Studio Code as a code editor in the first course section. There, I also explain my Visual Studio Code setup and how you can make sure that it looks and works for you as it does for me. So on code.visualstudio.com, you can download and install that for all operating systems. But again, make sure you have a look at this first course section where I walk through that in detail. Therefore, once you did all of that, simply open Visual Studio Code and then open this created project folder with Visual Studio Code, simply with File, Open, and then pick that folder which was created, which holds your React project. And you should see something like this there. You might not see all these subfolders and files, as this can also change over time, but you should definitely see a source, a src folder, and a package.json file. The package.json file in the end holds all the dependencies of this project, for example React, but also a couple of development dependencies which are involved with these transformation and optimization steps I was talking about. The src folder holds the actual source code you will be working on, and you will see more files in there than I have it here because I already cleaned up that folder. And speaking of that, I wanted to show you how you can create new React projects, because ultimately that is what you need once you're done with that course. But to make sure that we're all starting on the same page and we're all working on the same kind of project setup, attached you find this cleaned up starting project which I created for you. Simply download it, unzip it, and then open that with Visual Studio Code. That's the project we should continue on, because here we'll all have the exact same starting state, and you will learn the latest version of React with that as well. So make sure you download, unzip, and open that attached starting project, which is this cleaned up project originally created with Create React App. Once you did that, make sure you cancel that running development server, which we started a couple of seconds ago, by going to the terminal where this server is running and hit Ctrl+C in there, which will cancel it. And now, by the way, if you reload localhost 3000, you'll no longer see the website therefore. But we'll restart it in a second, but now based on this adjusted starting project I provided to you. Now here's a nice trick which I recommend that you use. We again need to start this development server to have that automatically updated preview of the application we're building. Now the best way of starting that server again is to go into Visual Studio Code, into that project which you opened up, and then here in the menu go to Terminal, New Terminal. And open a new terminal here, which is now your default system terminal or command prompt just integrated into Visual Studio Code. And in there, you need to run two commands. First of all, run npm install. This will look into the package.json file and download and install all the required packages and dependencies into this project folder. Simply enter this and hit enter. We didn't have to do this earlier because when we ran npx create react app, this was already included in the overall setup process. Now that I shared my starting project with you, you need to run this once to download and install all the dependencies. They are not part of the shared zip file, since that would unnecessarily bloat that zip file. Indeed, all course attachments which you find will be missing these locally downloaded and installed dependencies, since that would just increase the zip file size, and in the end you just need to run npm install in the downloaded and extracted zip files to recreate and re-download all the dependencies. You will now have a node modules folder here which holds all these dependencies. That's, by the way, a folder you should never edit or work in, because that's really just all these third-party packages downloaded onto your local system. Now, once that's done, you can run npm start again, and this will again bring up this development server. You should also keep that development server running as long as you're working on the code, because if you shut it down, you can't preview your application anymore, though you can always restart it by running npm start again. And as long as this process is running here, it will automatically watch your code files, and whenever you change something in code, it will automatically update the loaded page in the browser. So keep this process up and running here. Don't close this terminal, don't quit it with Ctrl+C unless you're done for the day. Now on localhost 3000, you should see something like this. Simply some let's get started text, which isn't particularly easy to read, but that's really just a dummy starting state on which we're going to build up on. And that is the starting project we're now going to work with. That's now our starting state where we can now finally dive into the React source code and start learning React. So, let's now have a look at this src folder, because that is where we will spend the majority of our time. That is where we will write our React code. And the first thing you'll notice here in this starting project, which I provided in the last lecture, that we have two JavaScript and one CSS file. And the most important takeaway here, which I really want to emphasize right away, is that React code is just JavaScript code. We are just going to write some JavaScript code throughout the entire course. We're going to use React features and some special syntax introduced by React, but ultimately, it'll all be just JavaScript. Now let's start with the index.js file. You don't see it anywhere, but I can tell you that this is actually the first code file which will be executed whenever this page is loaded. So whenever you visit localhost 3000 here at the moment, this index JavaScript file holds the code which is executed initially. Though I will also say right away that it's not exactly that code, but a transformed version of that code. Remember when I said that our project setup here involves some scripts which transform and optimize the code? Yeah, that is happening behind the scenes. Basically, we will write the code in a easy-to-read, developer-friendly way with some syntactic sugar, which makes our life as a developer easier, but we'll write code which wouldn't run like this in the browser, and especially not in all supported browsers. Therefore, the npm start process which we started here, which started this development server, which is watching our code, this process will not just watch our code and then take it and deliver it to the browser, but before it delivers it, it will transform it so that certain extra features work in the browser, even though they wouldn't work if just this code would be taken. For example, this import here, where we import a CSS file into a JavaScript file. That's not something which would work in regular JavaScript. That would be an invalid syntax. You can't import CSS into JavaScript. Well, here in this project setup, it does work. Here, in the end, it tells this npm start process, we could say, that we simply want to include this index CSS file into our overall application. That the CSS code in there should be considered and should be injected into this page, which is shown here on the screen. And that's why the styles defined in there, like the font family, but also the background color of the body, are picked up here on the screen on the page that we see. Another example for a syntax, which is not regular JavaScript syntax, would be this here. It looks like some kind of HTML code inside of a JavaScript file, and normally this also wouldn't work. Well, again, here it does work, but only because this is transformed before it's delivered to the browser. And for the moment, you just need to be aware of that those transformations happen, and that the idea of that simply is that we can write code in a nice way, in an easy way, and then still we have code in the end which runs in all browsers. Now, the fact that the index.js file is the first file to be executed is just something you have to know. I'm telling you that this is the case because indeed it is, and it's one of the few things you need to remember. Index.js here is the first file to execute. Now, what's that file doing though? What's happening here? Well, we are importing React DOM from React DOM, which in the end means we're importing something, some React DOM object, from the React DOM third-party library, which is one of our dependencies, which is downloaded and installed locally. Now, in the package.json file, you actually see two React dependencies, React just like that, and then this React DOM thing. And whilst this indeed technically are two separate packages, you can think of that as React, the library. It's split across two packages with different responsibilities, but in the end, React DOM and React, these two dependencies, together form the React library, which we're going to learn all about in this course. So whenever we import something from React or from React DOM, it's basically both all about React, and we're using React features, as we're doing it here in index.js, where we are importing from React DOM. This simply makes a feature exposed by the library available inside of this index.js file, because that's how modern JavaScript works in general. If you define a feature, let's say a function, in file A, and you want to use it in file B, to split your code across multiple files, to keep every file small and manageable, then you have to export the feature which you want to use in file B in file A, and then import it in file B. And that's what we're doing here. React DOM, this package, is exporting some React DOM object, and we're importing it here into index.js. And we are importing it to then call a method, the render method, on that imported object. The render method takes two arguments here, two parameters. The second argument is a default JavaScript DOM API, which we're calling. On the global document object, which is available in JavaScript, in browser-side JavaScript, I should say, we have a getElementById method to select a certain DOM HTML element by its ID. Now you might wonder, which element? We have no HTML code besides this strange thing here. Well, there also is a public folder, which I haven't talked about thus far. This folder is a folder in which we will rarely work, but it holds one important file, this index.html file. This is the single HTML file which is in the end loaded by the browser here. Because with React, we build a so-called single-page application, at least typically. And I talked about that in the first course section. It basically means that only one HTML file is delivered to the browser and hosted by the browser, therefore, rendered by the browser. But on this single file, we import the finished React application code, and it's that code which then updates what we see on the screen. So we have one HTML file, but what we see on the screen constantly changes because of React. Now in this HTML file, this index.html file, we have this div here though. It's basically the only HTML element in the entire body except for this no script element. And this div has an ID of root. Now actually, it's this div which is selected by this code snippet here. We target that div with the ID of root. And we're in the end telling React DOM that we want to render something, we'll have a look at that in a second, in this place. So that basically the content of this div, and as you can tell, there is no content, so what's inside of this div should be replaced with that. So of course that brings up another question. What is that app thing here? Well, first of all, it's also something which we're importing. We're importing app from the app file, and that's this app.js file. You just may omit, and you should omit .js as an extension in your imports here. If it's another file, like a CSS file, you have to add it. But if it's a third-party library or one of your JS files, you omit the .js. Now we can tell that it's one of our files because we have a relative import path here, starting with /, which means please look in the same folder as this index.js file is in, and then use the app.js file, so this file here. And from that file we import app. And then we do something with it, but that is definitely not regular JavaScript syntax here. Indeed, it isn't. This is a syntax called JSX, and I'll come back to it in a second. But before I come back to that, there's one key thing you gotta know about app. App, in the end, is a component. And you might remember, components are important. Here, we see our first component in action. It's this app component, which we in the end render in the place of that element with an ID of root. So in place of that div, or inside of that div to be precise. So therefore, let's now have a look at this app.js file. And this is a fairly trivial file. It holds a function named app, and we then export this function. Because, as I mentioned, in modern JavaScript, if you have something like a function or a class or an object defined in one file and you want to use it in another file, you have to export and import it. So here in app.js, where this function is defined, we export it and then we import it in index.js. And that's how these two files are connected and how we can use a feature, in this case a function, defined in app.js inside of index.js. Now what's this app.js function doing though? Not much, as you can tell. It's a function named app. Starting with a capital character might be a bit strange, but it's valid JavaScript syntax. And then all we do in here is we return something. But what we return again is strange. It's HTML code inside of a JavaScript file. And again, that's not something you regularly see. It's also not something we're used to. And it's also not valid JavaScript code, normally. Yet here, everything seems to work. And the reason for that is that this is a feature called JSX. It's a special syntax invented and introduced by the React team, and it works in these JavaScript files because of our overall project setup, and again, because of these transformation steps which are running behind the scenes. But let's take a closer look at JSX and what it is and how it works in the next lecture.